In the year of our Lord, 1692, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there existed a fear as cold and as deeply rooted as the ancient woods that pressed in on all sides. It was a fear of the invisible world, a palpable dread that the devil was not a distant tormentor in the fires of hell, but a neighbor, a whisper, a shadow that fell across the rough-hewn floor of your own home. And in the heart of the Salem settlement, this fear found its form in the silhouette of a lone woman who, during the solemnity of morning prayer, when all eyes were closed and every soul was bowed, was the only one who remained standing. If the archives of the damned whisper to you, and you find yourself for the first time in this place of forgotten testimony, consider subscribing. Join us as we unseal the records that history chose to bury. The dawn that broke on that particular Sabbath was a sliver of pewter beneath a bruised purple sky. It was a cold that did not just bite at the flesh but seemed to seep into the marrow, a damp and unforgiving chill that clung to the woolen cloaks of the faithful as they made their way toward the meeting house. The building itself was more a fortress than a place of worship, its unadorned timber walls a testament to a faith that valued fortitude over comfort. It stood stark against the skeletal fingers of the surrounding trees, a bastion of order in a wilderness they believed was rife with unholy chaos. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, human breath, and the faint, almost imperceptible odor of beeswax from the few candles that fought against the encroaching gloom. The light they offered was weak, a flickering, liquid gold that seemed to drown in the cavernous shadows that gathered in the rafters and pooled in the corners, leaving the faces of the congregation pale and drawn, like masks of piety carved from bone. They filed in not with joyous reverence, but with a grim, solemn determination. They were a people who believed their very souls were in a constant state of siege, and this weekly gathering was not a celebration, but a muster of troops for an unending war. The blacksmith, a man whose hands could bend iron but trembled when holding his worn psalter, found his place beside his wife. His one humanizing grace was the way he would discreetly reach out, his calloused thumb just brushing the back of her hand, a silent reassurance in the face of divine judgment. The farmer, his face a roadmap of hardship etched by sun and worry, sat with his sons, his gaze already distant, calculating the meager harvest against the coming winter, and praying it would be enough. There were women whose expressions were perpetually pinched with the anxiety of childbirth and child mortality, and men whose shoulders were permanently stooped, not just from labor, but from the immense weight of their perceived sins. They were a community bound together by a shared, oppressive covenant, their individual identities submerged into a single, fearful whole. At the head of this flock stood Reverend Ezra Pike, a man whose faith was as unyielding and severe as the landscape itself. He was not old, but the weight of his office had settled on him like a shroud, carving deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His voice, when it rose to greet them, was not warm, but resonant with the authority of the scriptures he held in his hands, its pages worn thin by years of desperate consultation. He believed in the absolute, unassailable power of God, and its terrible corollary, the insidious, ever-present reality of Satan. He scanned the faces of his congregation, searching for any sign of weakness, any crack in their spiritual armor through which damnation might creep. His gaze was that of a warden, not a shepherd. And then there was Martha Witt. She entered alone, as she always did, a quiet disturbance in the rigid order of the room. She was not a crone, nor was she marked by any outward sign of peculiarity, yet an invisible perimeter of suspicion seemed to surround her. The other women would shift on the hard pews, their bodies subtly angling away from her. The men would clear their throats and fix their eyes resolutely on the pulpit. Martha Witt's husband had been taken by a fever 2 winters past, and in her solitude, she had become a mirror in which the community saw its own anxieties reflected. Her quiet dignity was mistaken for pride, her self-possession for a secret wickedness. Her one concession to vanity was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, no bigger than her thumb, that she kept clutched in her hand, a final gift from her late husband, a carpenter of some skill. It was a small, tangible piece of a softer world, one that had no place within these severe walls. She found her usual spot on a bench near the back, isolated not by decree, but by a silent, collective shunning. Reverend Pike began the service, his voice a low, powerful cadence that filled the cold air. He spoke of the wickedness that festers in the idle heart, of the temptations that lie in wait within the shadows of the forest, and of the absolute necessity of unwavering, unquestioning faith. His words were stones cast into the still, dark pool of the congregation's fear. When the time for prayer arrived, a palpable shift occurred in the room. It was the moment of ultimate submission, the baring of the soul before an all-seeing, all-judging God. A low groan of creaking wood and rustling fabric swept through the meeting house as, in a single, unified motion, the congregation fell to its knees. Heads were bowed, eyes were squeezed shut in fervent concentration, and a low, corporate murmur of prayer rose like smoke toward the darkened rafters. Every man, every woman, every child folded themselves into a posture of humility, all, that is, except for one. In the back of the chapel, Martha Witt remained standing. It was not a grand, theatrical gesture of defiance. It was a quiet, absolute stillness that was, in its own way, more shocking than a scream. While every other figure was bent and hidden, her upright form was a stark, vertical accusation against the communal act of prostration. She did not look at the reverend. She did not look at her neighbors. Her head was not bowed in shame nor lifted in pride. It was turned slightly, her gaze fixed with an unnerving, unblinking intensity upon a specific, empty corner of the chapel. It was the darkest corner, a place where the feeble candlelight surrendered completely to shadow, where cobwebs hung like funerary shrouds, and where the chill of the earth seemed to bleed through the very foundation of the building. To anyone else, it was just a corner, a void. But Martha Witt stared into it as if she were reading a page of scripture, her expression not one of madness, but of lucid, focused attention. The first to notice was a young boy, who had cracked open an eye to peek at his mother. His small gasp was swallowed by the wave of prayer, but his wide-eyed stare did not go unnoticed. His mother, her prayer momentarily disturbed, followed his gaze. Her own intake of breath was sharper, a sound like tearing cloth. The awareness spread like a contagion, a ripple of disquiet moving through the kneeling forms, a whispered word, a surreptitious glance, a subtle shift in weight. The corporate prayer, once a unified murmur, began to fracture. It became a collection of individual, frightened whispers, the words of supplication now tinged with a new, terrestrial fear. What did she see? The question bloomed in the dark, fertile soil of their minds, a poisonous flower of speculation. The blacksmith, his eyes still closed, sensed the change in the room's atmosphere. The cadence of prayer was off, the collective rhythm broken. He risked a glance and saw her, standing like a pillar of salt, and his own prayers died in his throat. He felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with divine judgment, and everything to do with the woman in the back of the room. Some thought she was in the grip of a seizure, a fit sent by God as punishment for some secret sin. Others, their minds already steeped in folklore and whispered warnings, believed she was communing with a familiar, an imp sent from the devil to mock their sacred rites. The most terrifying thought, the one that barely dared to form itself into words, was that she was not looking at nothing. She was looking at something they could not see, something that had been invited into their holy space. Reverend Pike felt the disturbance as a physical force, a disruption in the spiritual current he was attempting to direct heavenward. He paused mid-sentence, the holy words turning to ash in his mouth. He opened his eyes, and the sight that greeted him sent a jolt of pure, cold fury through his veins. It was blasphemy, a flagrant, public rejection of the authority of God and the sanctity of his church. He saw her standing there, a solitary tree in a felled forest, and his first instinct was righteous anger. She was making a mockery of their faith, challenging the very bedrock of their existence. But as he held her gaze, or rather, the direction of her gaze, his anger was slowly replaced by a more primal emotion. It was an ancient fear, the fear of the unknown. Her focus was so absolute, so unwavering, that it began to feel less like defiance and more like a terrible, profound compulsion. The corner she stared at seemed to grow darker, colder, the shadows within it deepening, coalescing. Was it a trick of the light, a figment of his own strained imagination? Or was he, for the first time, seeing not just the corner, but the thing that had commanded her attention? The air grew heavy, the silence between the faltering prayers stretching into a taut, humming wire of tension. The entire congregation was now aware of her. Their kneeling forms a testament not to faith, but to a shared, paralyzed horror. They were trapped between the command to pray and the irresistible urge to look upon the abomination in their midst. When the prayer finally, mercifully, stumbled to its conclusion, the sound of the congregation rising to its feet was ragged and uncertain. There was no sense of spiritual relief, only a lingering, pervasive dread. They filed out of the meeting house with their eyes averted, casting furtive, fearful glances at Martha Witt, who remained in her spot, unmoving. She did not seem to notice their departure, her attention still held captive by the unseen presence in the corner. They hurried away, clutching their Bibles like talismans, the Reverend's sermon forgotten, replaced by a single, burning question that would curdle the milk in their pails and haunt the quiet of their homes. Reverend Pike waited until the last of them, a fretful mother pulling her wide-eyed child by the hand, had departed. The heavy oak door groaned shut, plunging the chapel into a deeper gloom. Now, only he and Martha Witt remained, two solitary figures in the vast, echoing silence. He approached her slowly, his footsteps loud and accusatory on the wooden floorboards. He stopped a few feet from her, his face a mask of stern, ecclesiastical authority, though beneath it, a current of profound unease was stirring. He demanded to know the meaning of this sacrilege. He spoke of the eternal damnation that awaited those who mock the house of God, his voice resonating with the practiced fire of the pulpit. He insisted that she kneel now, before him, and beg forgiveness for the grievous sin she had committed in the sight of the entire congregation. He commanded her to repent. Martha Witt did not move. For a long moment, she remained silent, her gaze still locked on the shadowed corner. Then, slowly, as if waking from a trance, she turned her head and looked at the Reverend. Her eyes were clear, lucid, and held no trace of madness or fear. They held only a deep, bottomless sorrow. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady, devoid of the hysteria he had expected. She told him that she could not kneel. She explained, with a calm that was more unsettling than any ranting could have been, that she did not dare bow her head. He pressed her, his voice rising, demanding to know what blasphemous reason she could possibly have for such a choice. She looked past him, back toward the corner, and gave him her answer. She said she could not close her eyes, because she was not the only one in the room who was standing. Reverend Pike's blood ran cold. The simple, declarative statement hung in the air between them, a pronouncement of such terrible implication that all the fire and brimstone of his theological training offered no defense against it. He looked again at the empty corner, at the deep and silent shadows, and for the first time in his life, he felt the true, suffocating presence of a fear for which he had no name. The seed of a terrible possibility had been planted, that Martha Witt's sin was not one of defiance, but of sight, and the thing she was seeing was only just beginning to make itself known. The heavy oak door of the meeting house closed with a sound of profound finality, a hollow boom that sealed the Reverend Ezra Pike inside with the woman and the terrifying shadow she had just cast upon his soul. For a moment, he did not speak. The silence that descended was not peaceful, but predatory. It was a weighted, listening silence, and the Reverend found himself straining his ears, half expecting to hear a rustle of movement from the corner where Martha Witt's gaze was still fixed. There was nothing. There was only the low moan of the wind against the timber walls and the frantic, hammering beat of his own heart. His initial fury had been a fire doused by a bucket of ice water, leaving behind only a cold, sickening vapor of dread. He, a man of God, a scholar of Scripture who could debate the finest points of predestination and divine providence, was standing in his own sanctuary, feeling like a child who has just been told that the monster under his bed is real. The rational part of his mind, the part that had been so rigorously trained in theological logic, screamed that this was a trick. It was a delusion born of grief and isolation, a textbook case of female hysteria, a phenomenon the learned men in Boston had written about at length. It was the devil's work, of course, a cunning and insidious assault on the heart of his flock, using its weakest member as a willing, or perhaps unwilling, vessel. He gathered the tattered remnants of his authority and took a step toward her, forcing a stern, commanding tone into his voice. He told her that he would not tolerate such blasphemous fantasy. He informed her that her soul was in mortal peril, and that these delusions were the whispers of Satan, sent to drag her down into the pit. He escorted her from the cold, echoing emptiness of the chapel, his hand firmly on her elbow, as if the physical contact could somehow ground her in reality and dispel the phantoms she claimed to see. He led her across the barren patch of earth that separated the meeting house from his own small, dark home. He did not take her to the parlor, a room for guests and polite conversation. He took her to his study, the very heart of his intellectual and spiritual world. This was his fortress. Here, surrounded by the weight of centuries of theological certainty, he believed he could excise the madness that had taken root in her mind. The room was small and suffocatingly neat. Bookshelves, groaning under the weight of heavy, leather-bound tomes, lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The air smelled of dry paper, aging leather, and the faint, acrid scent of ink. It was a room dedicated to the power of the Word, to the idea that all of creation's mysteries and terrors could be understood, categorized, and ultimately controlled through Scripture and exegesis. A single desk, its surface orderly and bare save for a stack of paper, a quill, and an oil lamp, stood in the center of the room. This was where he wrestled with God, where he composed the sermons that were meant to be a bulwark against the very chaos this woman now dragged in with her. He bade her sit on a simple wooden stool, while he remained standing behind the desk, a deliberate posture of authority and judgment. The lamp cast a small, trembling pool of light, illuminating their faces while the rest of the room dissolved into deep shadow. It was here, in this controlled environment, that he began his interrogation. He did not ask her what she had seen. He asked her what sin she was hiding. He pressed her to confess the secret corruption, the hidden apostasy that had allowed the adversary to gain such a foothold in her soul. He spoke of the snares of witchcraft, of the dark pacts made in the woods at midnight. His voice was a low, insistent drone, the voice of a man trying to convince himself as much as his subject. Martha Witt listened patiently, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady. The frantic energy of the chapel had fallen away from her, replaced by a strange, unnerving placidity. She was not a heretic brought to heal. She was a witness waiting to give testimony. When he had exhausted his accusations, she finally spoke, her voice as quiet as the dust motes dancing in the lamplight. She told the Reverend that it was not a sin that made her stand, but a duty. She said she saw figures. She described them not as the horned, monstrous demons of his sermons, but as something far more unsettling. They were silhouettes, she explained, shapes that looked like men and women, but they were made of shadow, voids in the very fabric of the room. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply stood in the corners, in the darkened aisles, and they watched. The Reverend felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. This was not the confession of a madwoman. The description was too precise, too calm. He demanded to know what they watched. He asked if they watched him, if they watched her. She shook her head slowly. She said they watched the congregation as they prayed. They watched the bowed heads and the closed eyes, and their attention was one of perfect, silent judgment. A fly, drawn to the lamp's glow, had become trapped in the sticky residue of oil at its base. It buzzed frantically, its tiny, desperate struggle a miniature drama in the oppressive stillness of the room. The Reverend found his eyes drawn to it, to its futile, panicked movements. He felt a strange kinship with the doomed insect. He tried another tactic, one of logic. He asked her when these visions had begun. He suggested they were born of grief, phantoms created by a mind unmoored by loss. She looked at him with that same sorrowful clarity and told him that they had only appeared recently, within the last few months. They had started as a flicker in the corner of her eye, a momentary darkening of the shadows, but they had grown stronger, more solid, with each passing Sabbath. The Reverend leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He posed the question he believed would finally break her delusion, the question that would expose the lie. He demanded that she name them. He asked her if they were the specters of the damned, demons sent from hell. He expected her to say yes, to confirm their supernatural, otherworldly origin. Martha Witt met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something that looked like fear, or perhaps pity. She told him that she did not know what they were, but she knew who they were. And then, she began to name them. She did not name the dead. She did not name the fallen angels from the Reverend's library of demonology. She spoke the names of the living. She named the blacksmith, a man known for his quiet piety and his regular tithes. She named the wife of a prosperous farmer, a woman whose charity was a model for the entire settlement. She named a deacon of the church, a man who sat at the very front of the congregation each Sunday, his face a mask of rapt devotion. She named a dozen people, all of them living, all of them members of his flock, all of them souls he had sworn to protect. With each name she uttered, a drop of hot wax from a nearby candle fell onto the open pages of the Bible that lay on his desk. Each drop sizzled for a moment, leaving a small, greasy stain upon the holy verses, a series of blemishes on the pristine Word of God. The Reverend felt as if the very foundations of his world were cracking beneath his feet. This was an order of madness he had never conceived of. It was not a simple case of a woman seeing spirits. It was an accusation of the most profound and terrifying kind. It suggested that the shadows she saw were not external invaders, but internal ones. They were the hidden, spiritual decay of his own people, made manifest. He rose to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He could not bear to hear another name. He shouted at her. He called her a liar, a slanderer, an instrument of discord sent by Satan to tear their community apart from the inside. He told her to get out of his house, to never speak of these blasphemous visions again. His voice was loud, but it was thin, brittle with a terror he could no longer conceal. Martha Witt stood, her calm demeanor finally broken by a visible tremor. She looked at him, and she said that she had not wished to see these things. She said it was a curse. She then turned and left the study, closing the door softly behind her, leaving the Reverend alone in the flickering light with the buzzing of the trapped fly and the terrible echo of her words. He did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk for hours, staring at the wax-spotted pages of his Bible, but the words swam before his eyes, meaningless squiggles of ink. The certainty that had been the bedrock of his life had been pulverized into fine dust. He tried to pray, but the words felt hollow, a meaningless incantation against a darkness that was no longer abstract. He kept seeing the faces of the people Martha had named, the stoic blacksmith, the charitable farmer's wife. He saw them in his mind's eye, kneeling in prayer, and then he saw the shadows standing behind them, watching. Was it possible? Could a person's soul be so corrupted that it cast its own dark reflection? The fly in the lamp oil had ceased its struggle. It lay still, its wings mired in the thick, golden liquid. The Reverend felt a profound and irrational wave of despair as he looked at it. Sometime after midnight, exhausted and spiritually adrift, he retired to his small, cold bed. He fell into a fitful, dream-plagued sleep, and in that sleep, the shadows came for him. He was not in a forest or a demonic landscape. He was in his own room, in his own bed. But the room was wrong. It was colder, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on his chest like a physical weight. And they were there, 3 of them. They stood at the foot of his bed, just as Martha had described them. Tall, human-shaped silhouettes, voids of absolute blackness against the gloom of the room. He could not see their faces, for they had none, but he could feel their collective gaze upon him, a pressure that was both physical and psychic. He was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream, and then they began to speak. It was not a human voice. It was a dry, sibilant whisper, like dead leaves skittering across a tombstone, and the words they whispered were the words of Scripture. They were the Psalms he had memorized as a child, the verses from the Gospel of John that he had quoted in his sermons, but they were twisted, inverted. The holy words were spoken backward, each syllable a perversion, a desecration of the sacred. The language of salvation was turned into a liturgy of damnation. It was an intimate and precise violation, an assault that targeted the very core of his being, turning his most sacred beliefs into a weapon against him. He woke with a jolt, sitting bolt upright in his bed. The room was empty. The sun was not yet risen, but a pale, sickly light was beginning to seep through his window. His body was bathed in a cold sweat, yet he did not feel the relief of waking from a nightmare. He felt the chilling certainty of having been awake the entire time. The dream had been too real, too specific. It had felt like a memory. He dressed with trembling hands, his mind a maelstrom of fear and confusion. Had his own mind betrayed him? Had Martha's madness infected him? Or had he been given a terrible, unholy glimpse behind the veil? The line between prophecy and delusion had been erased. He spent the morning in a fog of dread, unable to focus on his preparations for the coming week's sermon. He looked out his window and saw his congregation going about their daily chores, but he no longer saw them as a flock of the faithful. He saw a collection of souls, each potentially harboring a secret, silent twin made of shadow. Later that day, as the sun reached its zenith, a frantic knocking echoed on his door. It was the blacksmith's apprentice, a boy of no more than 15, his face pale and streaked with tears. He delivered the news in a choked, stammering voice. The blacksmith was dead. The boy had gone to the forge to start the afternoon's work and had found his master. The Reverend's first thought was of an accident, a terrible mishap with the fire or a heavy piece of iron. But the boy's next words disabused him of that notion. The blacksmith had not been burned or crushed. He had been found in the back corner of the forge, a space he used for storage. He was on his knees, his hands clasped together, as if in the midst of a fervent prayer. There was not a mark on his body. But his eyes, the boy sobbed. His eyes had been wide open, staring up into the empty corner with an expression of such profound and absolute terror that the boy would be haunted by it for the rest of his days. The Reverend Ezra Pike felt the last of his skepticism crumble into dust. The blacksmith, the first person Martha Witt had named, was dead, and he had died in a posture of prayer, his eyes fixed on an empty corner, just as she had been. The distinction between seeing and causing, between accusation and curse, had become terrifyingly, fatally blurred. He was no longer just a minister investigating a troubled parishioner. He was a man standing on the edge of a chasm, and he was beginning to see the same shadows moving in the depths. The death of the blacksmith descended upon the settlement not like a sudden storm, but like a creeping, unnatural fog. It seeped under doorways and through the cracks in the walls of every home, a cold and silent dread that clung to the very air they breathed. In a community where death was a constant, familiar companion, a grim reaper who took the young with fever and the old with the simple wearing out of their days, this particular passing was different. It was an anomaly, a tear in the predictable fabric of their lives. The official explanation, pronounced by the town's physician, a man whose medical knowledge was a thin veneer over a core of superstitious fear, was that the blacksmith had suffered a sudden and violent seizure of the heart, an apoplexy brought on by overwork and the oppressive summer heat. But this explanation satisfied no one. It was a flimsy bandage placed over a deep and festering wound of communal anxiety. The whispers that had once been confined to the pews of the meeting house now slithered through the entire town. They spoke of the blacksmith's final, terrified gaze fixed upon a corner that held nothing but shadows. And they spoke of Martha Witt, the woman who stood during prayer, who had been the first to see the darkness that now seemed to be claiming them. The Sunday following the blacksmith's demise was unlike any Sabbath the Reverend Ezra Pike had ever presided over. The heat was suffocating, a heavy, wet blanket that made every breath a conscious effort. The meeting house was packed, not with the usual spirit of pious obligation, but with a desperate, fearful seeking. The people came not just to worship, but to be seen, to affirm their presence among the living, to huddle together against a threat they could not name. The air within the chapel was almost unbreathable, a noxious mixture of sweat, the cloying sweetness of wilting wildflowers that a well-meaning woman had placed near the pulpit, and an underlying, faint scent of rot, as if something unseen were slowly decaying in the summer heat. Flies, fat and iridescent, buzzed in lazy, insolent circles, their droning a constant, maddening counterpoint to the strained silence of the congregation. The faces that looked up at the Reverend were no longer masks of stern piety. They were pale, twitching with nervousness, their eyes darting toward the dark corners of the room, toward the rafters, toward the empty space on the bench where the blacksmith had once Saturday paranoia, was a palpable entity in the room, a guest who had taken a seat in every pew. The Reverend himself was a changed man. The fire of righteous certainty that had once fueled his sermons had been banked, leaving only the cold ash of a profound and terrifying doubt. His hands, as he gripped the edges of the pulpit, trembled visibly. The pages of his prepared sermon, filled with warnings against false visions and the dangers of allowing the imagination to be swayed by grief and fear felt like a liar's script in his hands. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that what Martha Witt had seen was not a product of her imagination. He had seen the shadows himself, in the chilling verisimilitude of his dream. He had heard their blasphemous, inverted whispers, and he had seen the result of their attention in the blacksmith's lifeless, terrified eyes. His sermon, therefore, became a desperate, fractured thing. He spoke the words of warning, but his voice lacked conviction. He implored his flock to guard their hearts against the deceptions of the devil, but he felt like a general warning his troops about an enemy who had already breached the walls and was silently slitting their throats as they slept. His eyes kept straying from the faces of his congregation to the dark corners of the room, searching, dreading what he might find there. The very shadows seemed to have taken on a new depth, a new texture. They were no longer just an absence of light. They felt like a presence, a substance. When the time for prayer came, the unified groan of creaking wood was hesitant, ragged. The people knelt, but their movements were stiff with fear. They bowed their heads, but it was not with the humble submission of the faithful. It was the instinctive, fearful crouch of prey sensing a predator. And in the back, as before, Martha Witt remained standing. Her posture was unchanged, her gaze as fixed and intense as ever. But this time, no one whispered, no one gasped. Her solitary, standing form was no longer just an act of defiance. It was a confirmation of their worst fears. She was their sentinel, their unwilling prophetess, standing watch over a border that they had never known existed. They knelt with their eyes squeezed shut, but they were not praying for salvation. They were praying for the ordeal to be over, for the moment of vulnerability to pass. It was in the midst of this strained, fearful silence that a new sound pierced the air. It was not a man's voice, nor a woman's. It was the high, thin wail of a child, a young girl. The daughter of the farmer whose wife Martha had named was on her feet, her small body trembling, her finger pointing toward the empty space beside her on the pew. She was screaming. Her mother, her face ashen, tried to pull her down, to quiet her, but the child was inconsolable. Through her terrified sobs, the words tumbled out, clear and chilling in the silent chapel. She claimed she saw her father, not the man who was kneeling on the other side of her, his face a mask of bewildered horror. She was pointing to the empty space where her older brother, a boy who had been taken by the winter sickness 2 years prior, used to sit. The child wailed that she could see him. She said he was kneeling right there, beside her, and he was praying. The mother's desperate attempts to silence her daughter only amplified the child's terror. The farmer, his face a knot of confusion and rage, stood up and roughly pulled the child into his arms. His hand clamped over her mouth as he carried her, still struggling and crying, out of the meeting house. The heavy door slammed shut behind them, but the child's revelation remained, an invisible specter that now haunted the pews. The idea that the dead were not resting peacefully in the hallowed ground of the churchyard, but were still attending service, kneeling among them, was a horror beyond their capacity to comprehend. The line between the living and the dead, like the line between sanity and madness, was dissolving. The Reverend Pike stood frozen at the pulpit, his knuckles white where he gripped the wood. The child's vision had struck him with the force of a physical blow. The dead attending service. It was a grotesque parody of the communion of saints, a congregation of the damned mingling with the living. He looked at Martha Witt, and he saw that her gaze was no longer fixed on the corner of the room. It had lifted. Her head was tilted back, her eyes focused on the high, dark rafters, a place of deep, impenetrable shadow far above their heads. Her expression had changed. The placid sorrow was gone, replaced by a look of intense, almost clinical, concentration. She seemed to be watching something with a detached, analytical curiosity, as if observing the movements of an insect. And then, something happened that defied all rational explanation. A single, dark drop of liquid fell from the shadowed rafters and landed squarely on Martha Witt's upturned face. It struck her just below the eye, a dark tear on her pale skin. It was not water. It was too thick, too dark. It clung to her cheek for a moment before tracing a slow, viscous path down toward her jaw. She did not flinch. She did not wipe it away. She simply continued to stare upward, as if this were a perfectly normal, expected event. A low, collective moan of pure terror rose from the kneeling congregation. Several people scrambled to their feet, their prayers forgotten, their faces contorted with a primal fear. They had not seen what the child had seen. They could not see what Martha Witt was seeing. But they had all seen the drop fall. They had seen this impossible, unholy communion between the woman and the unseen thing that lurked in the darkness above them. The service disintegrated into chaos. People pushed and shoved their way toward the exit, their piety consumed by a desperate, animal instinct for self-preservation. They fled the house of God as if it were a burning building, pouring out into the oppressive heat of the day, their faces wild with a terror that would not be easily calmed. The Reverend Pike was left standing in the near-empty chapel, the echoes of their panic ringing in his ears. Only a few of the church elders remained, huddled together near the front, their faces gray with shock. And Martha Witt, who had not moved. The dark streak was still on her face, a profane anointment. The Reverend finally found his voice. It was a choked, strangled whisper. He asked her, his voice trembling, what she saw, what was in the rafters. She lowered her gaze from the ceiling and looked at him. Her eyes were wells of an ancient, weary knowledge. She told him that there was nothing in the rafters, not anymore. The statement was so simple, so direct, that it took him a moment to grasp its terrifying implication. The source of the dark drop was gone, but its presence had been confirmed. The madness was no longer confined to visions and dreams. It had become physical. It could touch them. The church was no longer a sanctuary. It was a hunting ground. Faith was no longer a shield. It was a lure. The fear that had been a subtle, creeping dread had now transformed into a full-blown hysteria. It was clear that the matter of Martha Witt could no longer be ignored or contained. She was not just a woman with strange visions. She was a focal point, a lightning rod for a storm that was now breaking over their heads. The elders, their faces grim, gathered around the Reverend. Their fear was quickly curdling into anger, into a desperate need for a scapegoat. The invisible enemy that haunted their church was beyond their reach, but the woman who saw it was not. A decision was made, not with a formal vote, but with a series of grim, determined nods. Religious authority, in the face of a terror it could not explain, was beginning to corrupt itself, turning from a tool of salvation into an instrument of persecution. That afternoon, the town magistrate was summoned. A tribunal would be convened. They would judge Martha Witt. They would put her on trial as a witch. The question that now hung over the entire settlement was no longer what Martha had seen, but whether, by seeing it, she had somehow called it into being, condemning them all by revealing a truth that they were never meant to witness. The tribunal was convened not with the solemn, deliberate process of established law, but with a panicked, desperate haste. Fear, having been allowed to fester in the dark corners of their minds, had now erupted into a feverish need for action, for a tangible target against which to vent their terror. The meeting house, the very site of the spiritual infection, was repurposed. It was stripped of its religious function and transformed into a courtroom, a theater for a tragedy that had already been written. The pulpit where Reverend Pike had preached of divine judgment became the seat of a far more terrestrial and far more fallible form of justice. The pews, once filled with the fearful faithful, were now packed with an eager, agitated audience, their faces a disturbing mosaic of outrage, morbid curiosity, and a grim, self-righteous satisfaction. They had come not to witness a fair hearing, but to see a foregone conclusion ratified, to watch the formal condemnation of the woman who had become the living embodiment of their collective dread. The air, still thick with the lingering heat of the day, was now charged with a new energy, the electric hum of impending violence. Dust motes, disturbed by the shuffling of so many bodies, floated in the beams of late afternoon sunlight that lanced through the tall, narrow windows, hanging in the air like suspended ash, a premonition of the fires to come. At the head of this makeshift court sat the magistrate, Samuel Town, a man whose understanding of the law was secondary to his fear of public opinion and his own deep-seated belief in the invisible war being waged for the soul of the colony. He was a stern, humorless man, his face set in a permanent scowl of grim responsibility. Beside him, looking pale and diminished, sat Reverend Pike. He was there as a spiritual advisor to the court, a role that felt like a cruel mockery. He, who was now a prisoner of the same visions that had condemned the woman before them, was being asked to provide the theological justification for her persecution. He felt like a fraud, a hollow man, his faith a shattered vessel. He looked out at the faces of his congregation, at the people he had baptized and married and eulogized, and he saw not a flock to be guided, but a mob to be feared. His one humanizing quality, a quiet pride in his scholarly, logical mind, had been utterly dismantled. He was adrift in a sea of supernatural horror, and he was clinging to the wreckage of a legal proceeding that he knew, in his heart, was a monstrous sin. Martha Witt was brought in, her hands bound loosely before her. She was not dragged or manhandled. Her captors, two stout farmers deputized for the occasion, kept a wary distance from her, as if her very touch might be a source of contagion. She showed no signs of fear or defiance. She walked with a quiet, somber grace, her expression one of profound, impenetrable calm. She was placed on a stool in the center of the room, alone, the focal point of hundreds of accusing eyes. The trial began, and it was a torrent of unsubstantiated fear and paranoia given the thin veneer of legal testimony. One by one, her accusers came forward, their voices ringing with a conviction born of hysteria. A neighbor, a woman with whom Martha had once had a disagreement over a wandering chicken, swore that she had seen shadowy shapes flitting around Martha's house at night. The farmer whose daughter had screamed in the chapel testified that his child had been struck with a fever and had been muttering delirious blasphemies ever since the incident, a clear sign that Martha had bewitched her. The wife of the deceased blacksmith, her face swollen with grief and malice, recounted a time when Martha had looked at her husband with what she now described as an unnatural intensity, a look that she was certain had been a curse, planting the seed of death within him. Each testimony built upon the last, a tapestry of supposition and innuendo, woven together with the dark threads of their shared terror. The scripture that echoed off the stone and timber walls was no longer the language of hope, but the language of accusation, verses about witches and familiar spirits cherry-picked to justify the proceedings. Through it all, Martha Witt remained silent. She did not refute the claims. She did not plead for mercy. She simply sat, her eyes downcast, listening, as if the proceedings were about someone else entirely, a stranger whose fate was of no concern to her. The magistrate, growing impatient with her silence, which he mistook for a sign of guilt and contempt for the court, finally addressed her directly. His voice boomed through the hall, demanding that she confess her congress with the devil. He demanded that she name her confederates, the other witches who lurked within the community. He promised her that a full and honest confession was her only path to salvation, her only hope of escaping the fires of hell, if not the gallows. It was then that she finally looked up. She did not look at the magistrate. She did not look at the jury of church elders. She looked out at the crowd, her gaze sweeping across the faces of her accusers, the people with whom she had shared this small, hard patch of earth. And then she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout of defiance or a cry of despair. It was clear, calm, and carried a chilling, almost supernatural resonance that cut through the agitated murmur of the crowd, silencing it completely. She said that she would confess. A collective sigh of satisfaction went through the room. The magistrate leaned forward, a grim smile touching his lips. But Martha Witt did not confess to witchcraft. She did not speak of pacts with the devil or midnight Sabbaths in the forest. She began to speak of sin. She turned her head and looked directly at the first witness, the neighbor who had spoken of shadows around her house. And Martha named her. She spoke the woman's name, and then she recounted, in precise, damning detail, a conversation the woman had had with her own sister just 3 nights prior, a conversation in which she had confessed to stealing money from the church collection plate, a small amount each week, for over a year. The woman's face went white. A strangled gasp escaped her lips, and she sank back into her seat, as if she had been physically struck. Martha Witt then turned her gaze to the farmer who had accused her of bewitching his child. She spoke his name, and she described how, on the last trip he had taken to the port town to sell his grain, he had spent the night with a prostitute, a sin he had carried back with him, a secret that had been festering in his heart. The farmer leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage, and began to scream that she was a liar, that these were devilish tricks. But as he screamed, his body began to twitch. The denials became garbled, slurring into nonsensical syllables. And then, to the horror of everyone present, his words began to twist, to invert. He began whispering prayers, the Lord's Prayer, but he was speaking it backward. The sacred words transformed into a guttural, demonic litany. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor, convulsing, his body jerking in a grotesque parody of religious ecstasy. Panic began to ripple through the crowd. This was not the orderly condemnation they had come to witness. The trial was turning on them. The accused had become the accuser, and her accusations carried with them a terrible, immediate power. One by one, Martha Witt moved through her accusers. She named the blacksmith's wife, and spoke of the bitter, jealous hatred she had harbored for her husband's success, a resentment she had confessed only to the silence of her own pillow. She named one of the church elders and recounted his secret habit of drinking himself into a stupor each night, a hypocrisy he concealed behind a mask of sober piety. She did not speak with anger or malice. She spoke with the detached, impersonal authority of a court clerk reading from a ledger. She was revealing the sins they had confessed only in the deepest, most secret chambers of their own hearts, the sins they believed were known only to God. And with each name that was spoken, the scene repeated itself. The accused would at first deny it, but their denials would quickly crumble in the face of her unnerving accuracy. The convulsions would begin, the backward prayers would spill from their lips, and they would collapse, struck down by the public revelation of their own hidden corruption. The tribunal of shadows had become a literal description. The shadows she had seen during prayer were now being given names, their human hosts identified and judged. The question of whether she was channeling judgment or summoning it became terrifyingly immediate. The meeting house was transforming from a courtroom into a madhouse. People were screaming, scrambling to get away from those who were convulsing on the floor, terrified that the affliction was contagious. The magistrate, Samuel Town, his face a mask of disbelief and horror, stood and began to shout, ordering the guards to seize her, to silence her. But the guards, their own faces pale with terror, would not move. They stared at Martha Witt as if she were a gorgon, capable of turning them to stone with a single glance. The Reverend Pike sat frozen, a silent witness to the unfolding apocalypse. He understood now. Martha had never been consorting with spirits. She had been seeing them. She saw the truth of their souls, the dark, spectral rot that lay beneath the carefully constructed facades of their piety. And now, for some reason, she had been given the power not just to see, but to reveal. The authority of the court, the authority of the church, it had all been a sham. The true judgment had begun. As the last of her primary accusers fell to the floor, babbling and twitching, the chaos in the room reached its crescendo. Someone, in their panicked flight, knocked over an oil lamp. The flame caught on a dry tapestry, and in an instant, the fire began to spread, climbing the dry timber walls with an unnatural speed. The screams of terror were now mixed with screams of pain as the room began to fill with thick, black smoke. The order of the tribunal dissolved completely into a primal stampede for the doors. That night, the church burned. It burned with a terrible, silent fury. The steeple, which had for so long stood as a proud finger pointing toward heaven, became a blazing torch. And then, with a groan of surrendering timber, it collapsed inward, not with a mighty crash, but with a strange, muffled silence, as if the very sound had been swallowed by the unholy chaos of the night. The heart of the community, the physical and spiritual center of their world, was gone, reduced to a heap of glowing embers and charred beams. The town of Salem had attempted to purge the unholy woman, and in doing so, had set a fire that had consumed them all. They had discovered, in the most horrific way imaginable, that the evil they sought to cast out was not in her. It was embedded, like a cancer, within themselves. The dawn that followed the fire was a study in gray. A fine, persistent drizzle began to fall shortly after midnight, a lamenting, weeping sky that did little to quench the smoldering ruins but succeeded in cloaking the entire settlement in a shroud of mist and misery. The acrid smell of charred wood and wet ash hung heavy in the air, a constant, nauseating reminder of the night's devastation. It was a scent that clung to clothes, seeped into the lungs, and seemed to stain the very soul. The meeting house, once the unyielding symbol of their spiritual and communal order, was now a blackened skeleton, a jagged wound in the heart of the town. Its collapse had left a void, both physical and psychological, that felt absolute. The bell, which had called them to worship and warned them of danger, lay half buried in the debris, its bronze surface cracked and blackened, silenced forever. The few survivors who moved through the muddy, ash-strewn lanes did so like ghosts, their faces hollowed out by shock and a deep, gnawing sense of divine abandonment. The chaos of the tribunal, the fire, the convulsions, it had all been too much. The rigid framework of their world, built upon the unshakable certainties of faith and order, had been utterly consumed in the flames, and they were now adrift in the terrifying wilderness of the unknown. Reverend Ezra Pike was among them, though he felt a universe apart. The fire had burned away his title, his home, his purpose, leaving behind only the raw, terrified man. His own small house, situated so close to the meeting house, had also been consumed by the inferno. He had escaped with nothing but the clothes on his back, and the terrible knowledge that was now branded onto his mind. He was a shepherd whose flock had been slaughtered, whose church had been razed, and he had been left standing in the ashes, a solitary witness to a judgment he had been too blind to foresee. He moved through the ruins of the chapel like a sleepwalker, the fine gray slush of ash and rain soaking through his boots. He was not searching for survivors. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that all who had been left inside, the magistrate, the elders, the convulsing accusers, were gone. He was searching for an answer. He was searching for some artifact, some piece of evidence that could lend a rational structure to the supernatural horror that had unfolded. His scholarly mind, though battered and nearly broken, still craved logic, a chain of cause and effect. He could not accept that this was a random act of demonic chaos. Martha Witt's calm, methodical pronouncements during the tribunal suggested a source, a script from which she was reading. It was this desperate, almost insane hope for a text that led him to the place where the pulpit had once stood. It was the epicenter of the devastation, a heap of charred timbers and blackened stone. Driven by an instinct he did not understand, he began to dig through the debris. His hands, soft and unaccustomed to labor, were quickly scraped raw and covered in a black paste of soot and mud. He worked with a feverish intensity, ignoring the rain that plastered his hair to his scalp and ran in grimy rivulets down his face. For what felt like hours, he found nothing but scorched wood and shattered fragments of the stone foundation, and then his fingers brushed against something that was not stone, not wood. It was leather. It was smooth and cool and impossibly intact. He dug around it, his heart hammering against his ribs, and slowly he unearthed it. It was a book. A large, bound volume, its heavy leather cover unmarked by any title or insignia. It was completely untouched by the fire that had consumed everything around it. It seemed to have absorbed the heat, the smoke, the very essence of the destruction, leaving its exterior pristine and its contents protected. It felt wrong in his hands, unnaturally heavy, impossibly preserved. It was an object that defied the laws of nature, an artifact from the very heart of the mystery. He carried it away from the ruins, seeking the shelter of a nearby barn that had been spared the flames. He sat in the dusty, animal-scented gloom, the book resting on his knees. His hands trembled so violently that he could barely work the simple metal clasp that held it shut. When he finally managed to open it, the sight that greeted him stole the breath from his lungs. The pages were not paper or vellum. They felt strange, almost like dried skin, and they were covered in a script that was at once elegant and deeply unsettling. The ink was not black or brown. It was a dark, rusty red, with a faint, coppery sheen. With a dawning, sickening horror, the Reverend realized it had been written in blood. This was not a Bible, not a book of Psalms. It was something else entirely. It was a record, a ledger of the town's spiritual decay. Each page was dedicated to a single member of the congregation. At the top of the page was a name, written in that same blood-red script, and beneath the name was a meticulously detailed account of their deepest, most secret sins. It was all there. The neighbor's petty thefts from the collection plate, the farmer's infidelity, the elder's secret drunkenness. Every sin that Martha Witt had named in the tribunal was recorded on these pages, described with a chilling, omniscient clarity that went far beyond mere gossip or speculation. But the most terrifying part was the dates. Beside each entry, each confession of a corrupted soul was a date. The Reverend's blood ran cold as he began to cross-reference them in his mind. The date beside the blacksmith's entry, which detailed a profound crisis of faith and a secret, festering resentment toward God for the death of his young son, was dated 2 weeks before the man had been found dead in his forge. The date beside the entry for the farmer's wife, which described a secret and venomous jealousy toward her more prosperous neighbors, was dated a week before she had accused Martha Witt in the tribunal. The book was not just a record of sins, it was a chronicle of condemnation. It was a timetable of death. The book seemed to be not just describing the moral decay, but predicting, or perhaps even causing, the final, fatal consequences. It was a work of prophecy, a divine or demonic accounting of a community that had rotted from the inside out. Who could have written such a thing? The script was precise, the language articulate, but the knowledge it contained was impossible. It suggested an author who was not just an observer, but a confessor, someone who could see directly into the darkest corners of the human heart. The idea of Martha Witt, a simple, unlettered woman, composing such a document was absurd. She had not been the author. She had been the reader, the oracle. Someone, or something, had been her unseen informant. He turned the pages with a growing sense of fatalistic dread, his own life, his own soul, feeling increasingly small and insignificant in the face of this terrible, implacable record. He passed the pages of those who had died in the fire, their sins of pride, hypocrisy, and false witness all meticulously catalogued, their final judgment recorded in the flames of the meeting house. He knew, before he even reached it, what he would find near the end of the book, and there it was, a new page, the ink still looking unnervingly fresh, almost wet, and at the top of the page, in the same elegant blood-red script, was his own name, Ezra Pike. He felt his vision begin to narrow, the dusty air of the barn seeming to thin, to become unbreathable. He forced himself to read the entry beneath his name. It did not speak of the common sins of the flesh. It spoke of the far deeper sins of the soul. It described his pride, his intellectual vanity, his belief that God could be understood and contained within the pages of his books. It spoke of his cowardice, his silence in the face of injustice, his decision to stand by and watch as an innocent woman was persecuted to satisfy the bloodlust of a terrified mob. It laid the entire, shameful truth of his spiritual bankruptcy bare on the page. It was an autopsy of his faith, performed with a surgeon's precision. And then, at the bottom of the page, beside the damning indictment of his soul, was the date. It was tomorrow's date, October the 26th, 1692. The book fell from his lap and landed with a soft thud in the dirt floor of the barn. He stared at it, not with the terror of a man who has just been given a death sentence, but with a strange, almost peaceful sense of resignation. The mystery was not solved, but its terrible scope had been revealed. He was not just a witness to this tragedy. He was a character in it, his final chapter already written. The question that had haunted him, the question of who or what was behind these events, was now eclipsed by a far more urgent and personal one. What did one do on the last day of one's life? He knew he could not run. The book's authority felt absolute, its pronouncements as inevitable as the rising of the Sunday. There was no escape from this judgment. There was only one thing left to do. He had to find Martha Witt. He had to stand before her one final time, not as a minister, not as an interrogator, but as a condemned man seeking a final confession from his judge. He had to ask her the question that now burned brighter than any other. Was she an instrument of God, or an agent of the devil? Was she possessed, or was she chosen? He had to know the nature of the power that had condemned him before he was forced to meet it. He stood up, leaving the book where it lay, a dark and terrible testament in the dust. As he stepped out of the barn, the rain began to fall harder. The world before him was a washed-out landscape of gray ash and gray sky, the hush before the final storm. He had one day left to find the truth. The final day of Reverend Ezra Pike's life was a pilgrimage through the ruins of his world. The rain, which had fallen with a soft, mournful persistence through the night, had finally ceased, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnervingly silent. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the bruised-looking clouds, casting a weak and spectral light upon the devastation. The air was cold, and carried the clean, sharp scent of wet earth and the lingering phantom smell of smoke. The survivors, the few who had not perished in the fire or fled into the surrounding woods, had begun to emerge from their homes, their movements slow and tentative, like animals emerging from their burrows after a forest fire. They moved through the wreckage of their community with a dazed, hollow-eyed disbelief, their faces blank masks of trauma. There were no wails of grief, no cries of outrage. The catastrophe had been too absolute, too profound, for such simple emotional displays. All that remained was a vast, echoing silence, the silence of a world that had been unmade. Reverend Pike walked through this silent landscape, a ghost among ghosts. The terrible knowledge of his own impending death, a secret he carried like a lead weight in the pit of his stomach, had stripped him of all his former vanities and fears. He was no longer a minister, no longer a community leader. He was simply a man walking toward his own, preordained end. His quest to find Martha Witt was not born of a desire to prevent his fate, but to understand it. He needed to look into the eyes of the woman who had been the oracle of his damnation and see for himself the nature of the power she served. He did not have to search for long. He was drawn, by an instinct he did not question, back to the source, back to the blackened, skeletal remains of the meeting house. And there she was. She stood in the exact center of the ruins, on the very spot where the pulpit had once stood, the place where he had preached his hollow sermons, and where the unholy book had been concealed. She was standing, as she had stood in the chapel, her posture erect, her body perfectly still. She was surrounded by the charred timbers and fallen stones, a solitary, living figure in a landscape of death and decay. As he drew closer, he saw that she was not alone. The air around her seemed to shimmer, to vibrate with an unseen presence. He could not see them with his eyes, not in the clear light of day, but he could feel them. It was a pressure on the air, a profound and unnerving sense of being watched by a vast, silent multitude. The invisible figures she had described, the shadows that had haunted his dreams, were there. They formed a silent, spectral congregation around her, their unseen faces all turned toward her, their silent attention a force that was almost physical in its intensity. Martha Witt was not looking at the ruins. She was not looking at the sky. Her gaze was directed straight ahead, into the middle distance, as if she were addressing this invisible assembly. The Reverend stopped a few feet from the edge of the ruins, hesitant to step onto the desecrated ground. He called her name. His voice sounded small and thin in the vast silence. She turned her head slowly, her movements fluid and unhurried. She looked at him, and her eyes held no surprise, no anger, no fear. They held only a vast, cosmic weariness, the look of a soul that has been made to bear a burden too great for any mortal to carry. He asked her the questions that had burned in his mind throughout the long, dark night. He asked her if she served the devil. He asked if she had summoned the demons that had torn their community apart. He asked if she was a witch. He spoke the words not as an accuser, but as a penitent, a man seeking a final, absolving truth before the end. Martha Witt listened, and when he was finished, a faint, sad smile touched her lips. She told him that she had never seen a demon in her life. She said that the horned, monstrous creatures of his sermons were fictions, childish fables created by men to explain a darkness that was far more simple and far more terrifying. She explained that the figures she saw were not invaders from hell. They were the souls of his own congregation. She told him that what she had been cursed, or perhaps chosen, to see was the truth that their piety was meant to conceal. She saw the blacksmith, whose prayers were not of praise but of bitter accusation against a God he secretly hated. She saw the farmer's wife, whose kneeling form was a mask for a soul consumed by envy. She saw the elder, whose bowed head was a pretense to hide a mind fogged with alcohol. She saw them all, not as they presented themselves to the world, but as they truly were in the secret, silent courts of their own hearts. She had not seen demons. She had seen the truth. She had seen the souls of those who prayed without belief. The Reverend stared at her, the terrible, simple logic of her explanation settling over him like a shroud. It was a truth so profound and so damning that it eclipsed all of his complex theology. The shadows were not an external evil. They were a reflection of an internal one. The book had not been a demonic text. It had been a divine one, a ledger of souls kept by an accountant who could not be deceived. The fire, the convulsions, the deaths, they had not been the work of a witch. They had been the inevitable, physical manifestation of a spiritual rot that had been allowed to fester for years. The congregation had not been condemned by Martha Witt. They had condemned themselves, long ago, in the silent hypocrisy of their own prayers. The Reverend finally understood. Martha was not an agent of the devil. She was an instrument of a divine sight so pure and so absolute that it was, in its own way, a form of damnation. She was doomed to see the sin that others could not, and in the end, to bear the punishment for their refusal to see it themselves. As the first, pure rays of the morning sun broke through the clouds, a golden light fell across the ruins, illuminating the scene with a strange, theatrical beauty. Ash, stirred by a gentle breeze, drifted through the light like motes of dark snow. Martha Witt looked at the Reverend, her expression softening into one of pity. She told him that his name was in the book not because he was evil, but because he was blind. She said his sin was not heresy, but the pride of a man who believed that faith could be contained in a building of wood and stone. She then turned her gaze away from him, back toward the rising Sunday. And as the light grew stronger, something extraordinary began to happen. Her form, which had been so solid and present, began to lose its substance. She became translucent, the light passing through her. The edges of her silhouette softened, blurring into the morning mist. She did not ascend to the heavens in a pillar of fire, nor did she descend into the earth. She simply faded, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain, until she was gone. The invisible congregation that had surrounded her vanished with her. The pressure on the air was gone. The sense of being watched was gone. All that remained was silence. The Reverend Ezra Pike stood alone in the ruins of his church, a solitary witness to a miracle or an apocalypse. He no longer knew the difference. The sun was now fully risen, its light warm on his face. He felt a strange sense of peace descend upon him. The fear of death had been replaced by a profound understanding. He looked at the place where Martha Witt had stood, and for the first time in his adult life, he fell to his knees. He was not praying. He was simply kneeling, an act of pure, unadorned submission. He did not bow his head. He did not close his eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, on the empty space where she had been. He understood now. Blindness was not the absence of sight. It was the refusal to stand and look at the truth. He remained there for a long time, as the sun climbed higher in the sky. He did not know when or how the end would come, and he no longer cared. He had seen the truth, and in the face of such terrible, beautiful clarity, his own fate seemed a small and insignificant detail. His final sermon, the one that would be written by his own death, would be a warning, unseen and unread, that the most terrifying shadows are the ones we cast ourselves, and that true damnation is not to be found in hell, but in a prayer spoken with a closed heart. The case file on the woman who would not kneel is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.